Hello, welcome back, or if you're new, hello and welcome. If you are new, I would recommend watching a different video because first of all, I'm giving baking tips, and second of all, this isn't my favorite piece of art I've ever made for the channel, so I recommend going and watching one of those videos where I'm just like, oh, the art turned out amazing here. Or the literal introduction at the very start of the channel, and I should have a playlist that has it right at the front if you have trouble finding it. So yeah, I'm giving baking tips, and a little bit about the art piece before we start the baking tips is I decided to do a pen sketch because I was like, we've been using markers for a while, I kind of want to take a little break from markers and just use a pen, and it didn't turn out great, it didn't turn out bad, it's just a piece of art that exists now and is on the channel. I've done really good pen sketches. One of my pen sketch videos happens to be like the third most viewed on the channel, and it's a mermaid because they're all mermaids. They always are. I guess they're just one of the more favorited things to watch here. So along the lines of that, I just want to mention something else. This video was already in the lineup because I had already said something about wanting to make a baking tips video that was people who are beginners or just want an interesting tip. Some of these aren't really tips, they're more just preferences, and I'll just tell you why I use them and why they're interesting. I have about 8 of them here, and I'm very excited to tell them to you. And if you're watching this upload June 17th, happy National Apple Fritter Day. Or if there's a correction, I'll pop it up right now. And if you're watching this June 18th or June 17th, happy Father's Day to any fathers out there. I highly doubt they're watching the video, but just go tell a random man with a child happy Father's Day. Actually, maybe don't actually do that. Anyway, the intro's getting too long, so let's hop into it now. Okay, so number 1 on my list is to pull the butter off the stove before all the butter melts. Now this is only for people trying to melt their butter down to liquid. If you are trying to brown your butter or only slightly melt it, this is not going to really apply to you. Now basically your butter should look something like this. I should pop up a picture. And when it looks like that, you should just pull it off the stove because the rest of the melted butter should just melt these little chunks into also liquid, especially if you stir it. Now, the reasoning behind this is to get your butter cooler. It'll melt, like, it doesn't melt faster, but it does cool your butter faster if your recipe needs your butter to cool after it's been kind of liquefied. So I figured it would be it's a very common thing, so I figured it would be a very good tip to include. So yeah, that's tip number 1. Okay, tip number 2 is for all of my sprinkle enjoyers in the audience. I know you're there. I can smell you by all the sprinkles in your pockets. Anyway, some sprinkles melt in the oven while others harden. Now, this is an interesting one that I figure a lot of people may or may not know, depending on how you use your sprinkles. If you only sprinkle after your stuff comes out of the oven, you should really consider baking them into cakes or cupcakes. They can be very pretty. I'll put up a little picture of a funfetti cupcake. Dang, I'm gonna have to search up food again. Anyway, now if your sprinkles look a little something like this, do you see all these little hard bits and pieces in here? These usually don't melt. I say that because I know that there are probably brands that make some that do just melt in the oven. I'm talking about ones that have a harder rounding, kind of more like a piece of candy than a sprinkle. These are not going to melt right away and will actually get harder because of the way that the sugar is. These can often actually hurt your teeth because of how hard they are, so I'd recommend putting them on last. But if you want something like this, these are known as Jimmy sprinkles. They're very simple, but they are very effective, which makes, here, I'll pop the picture up again, of the funfetti variety. It makes basically this. Or you can put both on after. It doesn't really matter. So tip number 3 is one of those tips that I was talking about that was more of a preference. Now tip is for do not measure your chocolate, just eye it. Now I'm not going to recommend this for every recipe because I know that there's certain recipes that do require only a certain amount of chocolate and not more, not less, or the recipe will turn out pretty bad. This more applies for if you're making chocolate chip cookies, cookie bars, anything that you can you don't actually have to measure your chocolate chips, you can just eye it. And basically, this tip applies especially for different recipes because some recipes add too much chocolate while others others add too little chocolate. And so I personally just eyeball like all the recipes of chocolate I make. Personally, because I've baked for a long time, I just kind of know the measurements a little bit better, so I don't always have to measure it. And I also I always like to equal out my chocolate chips, and it also helps with tip number 4 too. Tip number 4 being save some chocolate for the top. Now, when you're making especially chocolate chip cookie bars, chocolate chip cookies, brownies, anything that you're going to be putting chocolate chips on the top of, you should put them on in the oven because it will melt down. And also, things like chocolate chip cookies, you should pull a little bit of chocolate that you're going to mix in to the side. So don't fully chocolate yet. Then when you spread out your batter or plop it onto a sheet pan, add some of those chocolate chips to the top. I even do this for cookies that do circles because then the chocolate chips still melt down onto the top of it. They basically the ball will melt and then the chocolate chips basically just float until they melt down onto the chocolate chips. I'm obviously talking about a recipe I've used. I know that there's some that probably don't do that and would just totally melt the chocolate to the point of oblivion. I'm not having a good time pronouncing words, but the video is still going really fast today. Okay, so tip number 5 is for all of my cottagecore audience out there. There might be some of you out there. And this is for those of you who also want to just make savory stuff, such as bread. So when it comes to bread, there's all that rising and mixing and rising and mixing. But we don't typically call it mixing. We call it kneading. So tip number 5 is knead with flour. Now, the reason it is knead with flour is because it's much easier to knead with flour than it is to just knead on the counter. Most recipes will tell you to dust the surface that you are kneading on with a light coating of flour, or heavily dust your surface with a heavy covering of flour. And this may help in a few different ways. Number 1 is it usually sticks to your hands less. Number 2 is a lot of times recipes will tell you to not measure all your flour so that you mix it in vanilla kneading. And so when you knead, you're also helping knead in some flour. So it actually is helpful for not sticking to your hands and kneading in the rest of the flour, which will make your bread turn out very nice. And a little tip for kneading: if you're having trouble kneading, watch someone playing with slime or kneading their slime because it is very helpful. I don't personally like slime, so I don't watch it, but I've had tons of friends who used to play with slime, so I just watched when they did it. I don't like slime. It just doesn't feel nice. Okay, so this one also comes with the whole flour category because number 6 is add flour with fruit. Now, the reason it is titled this is because we're working with fruit, whether it be frozen or fresh. And the reason for this is most fruit, except for things like banana, have a lot of water or juice. And basically, you want to add more flour because it actually helps balance out the juices in the fruit than it would without it. I've learned this from working with lots of fruit-based things. I have noticed that you don't really need to do this with banana bread because bananas don't really have that juice. If your bananas do, then I'm a little concerned because I don't think they're supposed to do that. But for fruit like blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, strawberries, cherries, things that have juice, you should probably add just a little bit more flour to your recipe if it doesn't call for fruit. Like, for instance, you're making a muffin recipe, you love these muffins, but you think that they would taste good with strawberries or apple or blueberry, but they don't have a recipe on their website that actually has those. Just add a teeny bit more water than you would with a normal recipe, unless you're adding banana, but still, lots of people online could probably have videos on how you can balance out your fruit more evenly, or even taking out more liquid, if that's what you prefer. So I used to take a baking class when I was a little bit younger, and I didn't finish the whole thing. First, the recipe's really basic. I cook a lot, so I'm very used to having to cook different things, so my brain is very flexible, and everything we were baking was pretty much something I had already baked. And amateur hour. Every girl/one boy in the class were really beginners, so this is kind of a shout out to you guys, and also I hope you guys get better at baking. I really do. I really do. And so this is for really beginners. Number 7, do all your dry ingredients first and your wet last. Now, I used to see people a lot of times in this baking class taking their teaspoon. They needed a teaspoon of cinnamon or a teaspoon of water. Let's just say that they needed both. And so they would do the teaspoon of water first because on the recipe it says add your water and cinnamon to a bowl. This is imaginary recipe. I'm not sure if any of this is actually real. And they would do the water first because the recipe said so. And I would just tell them, no, just because the recipe says that you have to add in, if it says you have to add in flour and then sugar, then you should do it that way. If it says add your water and cinnamon to a bowl, then you can add the cinnamon and water first. So you should not just add your water and then your cinnamon, because all the cinnamon that you're trying to get is going to stick to your measuring spoon or cup, depending on what you're using. So I just recommend maybe doing all of your wet ingredients last, because it'll both save you like the tiniest bit of money and also pain because you can't get all of the dry ingredient out. It'll also like help a lot, I think. Okay, you've basically gone through all of the baking tips that I have for you, except for one. This one is the best, the biggest, the most amazing tip that you will ever hear in your entire lifetime. I have it right here. It is number 8. It is the most important recipe tip that you could ever learn. Oh my god, I just moved the chair. Sorry for that little jump scare there. Anyway, number 8 is make sure to try your batter. I do not care how much people are like, oh, flour has salmonella, eggs have salmonella, but if you use, vegan dough, you could just eat a ton of it. I don't care. Unless you're a person who just catches, like, sickness left and right, I would just say, just dip your finger in a little bit of it, just put it in your mouth, taste it a little bit, tastes good, it tastes bad. Well, before you put it in the pan to go into the oven. Obviously, this tip is just a joke. So technically, I did have 7 amazing tips, which works well because 7 just so happens to be my birthday and one of my lucky numbers. So, yeah, thank you for joining me in my tips. And now, on to my least favorite part of the video, my shameful plugs. So yeah, thank you for watching, and if you want to support me beside here, you can follow me on Pinterest, because I post there too. I actually posted 2 more new things on there that I will not be putting on my channel right now, unless you want to go look. Anyway, it's Nibs is Sketching, basically the same, and I will see you later. Bye!